Next up, everyone, we have Jonathan Enns from, of course, our school. And Jonathan, as everyone knows, is from the School of Architecture. His work mainly focuses on human-centered design in architecture and spatial innovation. He also operates the Humanics Lab, a collective which is involved in the development of design research and experimental prototyping. So Jonathan, take it away.
All right, you guys can hear me? Just give me a nod if that's okay. Great.
Yeah, that sounds good.
I feel like an unenviable situation of going last because I'm gonna bear the fruits of some work here at the school, which I hope I think we have a bunch of students you guys may have seen already or participated in, and also some attempts to address these issues in practice. I just wanted to thank you guys, Winston and Vincent, for setting this up. I really think this space to discuss these kind of niche topics that also can kind of invite people like Oliver from neighboring departments over into is really great to have. And I think also on behalf of our admin, just encouraging us to have this space to talk about these issues is really appreciated. So I think I'm gonna zoom out a little bit. I've been really interested in the practice, in the gaps in the practice of architecture and how architecture does or does not address aspects of human use that have found ways of being addressed in other fields. And so I'm going to talk a bit about practice, but I'm also going to tie in hopefully a few things that you'll find links to, I think, in both Theodora and Oliver's presentation. And I'm looking forward to tying this all up in the discussion. But I guess if I try to really zoom out, I'm here. You see one of these Yona Friedman graphics. It's something that I know some of my students have seen, but it kind of articulates a problem that I think still exists, which was noted back in the 70s, but that I think hasn't really been solved, which is that architects translate needs from people that are going to use the products they're creating into a design document. And that translation process has different forms it can take. But ultimately, whatever the form it takes, there's kind of a bandwidth. There's an ability to deal with a certain amount of complexity coming from the people you're talking about to translate that into the design requirements document, let's say. And I think we still are struggling with the bandwidth, and I don't think architects have a wide enough bandwidth at the moment. And some of the problems that get picked up when you start studying architecture under the lens of human-centered design come from the fact that we often design with an average fictitious user in mind, simply because it's difficult to manage all of the information needed to design for everybody. And so I think the question for me has been in practice and at the school really has been to think about the interface between humans and the products we create, and to think about the use of architecture and to ask how we can design for all more than just the average. And what that exposes my work to is a number of established fields, and so I think I'm going to attempt to stay kind of high level, but it touches on a number of things. To give you some examples of the problems, we know that our populations are aging, and that in many cases in all cases we're responsible for crafting the spaces that will host the end of life. And we all have parents and relatives that have been in these spaces or will be in these spaces. And we can, and there are so many problems that lead to undignified occupation of these spaces in the later phases of life that that we could start to address now and we could understand more squarely by doing more human-centered design. I also needed to, right, okay, I'll get back to my 2 points. So, you know, for example, you know, lack of expression in these spaces, lack of a community is sometimes something that really is painful when you end up in a long-term care facility. The language, let's say the design language itself is institutionalized, is standardized, and is not, you know, different in any cases, and maybe it doesn't enable one to personalize anything. And there's a question of character and maybe even ghettoization, that we put old people with old people, and these are all problems that we know exist and that we can address. Another, by the way, I'm in Iqaluit right now, and some of these problems are close to heart and are painfully visible to me at the moment. But another kind of problem with our design bandwidth is that we design much indigenous housing with an average user in mind without actually knowing how the indigenous population uses these spaces. These houses and homes are all very standardized and are built with 20, 30-year timelines in mind, but end up lasting much, much longer. So one is just a realization of how people use these places and how long they have to last, and how much quality needs to be put into them. But another is just, you know, the fact that we aren't familiar with, the designer is not familiar perhaps with a different form of occupation. So lack of regard for communal living, patterns of use, meat preparation space, the bulkiness of clothing in the north, storage rooms, and the large kind of family gatherings that have to happen in these spaces are all pieces of information that don't get represented when we entertain an average user, and in this case, a Southern, as they'd say up here, a Southern average user, so someone in Ontario. So our architectural inputs need to get broader. And then finally, we're seeing, I mean, we're gonna see a shift, and we are seeing a shift. You know, I think the type of architecture that we think is common, which is all around us, which is the building of condos in cities, is dwarfed by the architecture that is happening in the developing economies. And the process of this design in the developing world is a lot different than the process of design here. And could it be that our methods can start to look at how to contribute to these parts of the world or these situations? So this is a quote from Parvin, who has a TED Talk on this topic. And here are two of his slides. He's talking about a city like Toronto and your design team of 6, and the vast increase of floor space that's happening in other economies, and the design by the people, and wondering how could we give tools to direct our tools at the places where so much of this novice design is happening. I'll read this. Globally right now, the fastest growing cities are not skyscraper cities, they are the self-made cities in one form or another. If we're talking about the 21st century city, these are the guys that are going to be making it. Like it or not, welcome to the world's biggest design team. So the question of where design is happening. So I'm kind of splitting this up into inputs and outputs, which reflects my own interests. As I think about this question of democratizing design, I think there are two, for me, there's two kind of related but different territories. One is again, how do we do human-centered design and get democratic inputs into the design problem? And the second is, how do we design architecture so that it can be democratic? How do we actually design the product? So design for people, human-centered design in architecture. It's a popular term. We've heard this term a lot. It's part of the reason I left teaching, because I had been either hearing or talking about it myself, but wanted to understand how this human-centered design tactics were deployed in practice. And it's an approach to problem solving commonly used in design and management that develops solutions to problems by involving the human perspective in all steps of the problem-solving process. It's something that I think architects talk a lot about, but actually practice quite differently when you see it happening in the real world. You know, my perspective on, I'm going to give you 3 reasons why I think it's difficult for architects to practice human-centered design in a good way. One is that I think that architects have fostered a position of removal from the full design process that started in the 1400s, as Mario Carpo talks about. He calls this the Albertian model, with the architect's removal from the job site. Back in kind of the master building age, design, let's think a cathedral, was the result of collective knowledge. And so you had the inputs of a broad collective. And we've moved to a form or structure of design where design can be seen as an act of genius. I mean, just think about our studio process and how often you feel that your design project is this gnawing problem that you just have to crack on your own, you know, in studio, or, you know, with your tutor, but that the problem actually, the solutions to these don't typically come from going out into the world and exposing yourself to others' opinions on the matter. This is obviously broad stroke, but we do sometimes have a position of removal. The second is that our profession makes human-centered design hard to practice in architecture because our design processes are also removed. You think of the linear phases that we learn in pro practice about of schematic design, design development, contract docs, bidding, construction. Next to it here, you see a famous graph that I'll talk about in a second, graphic that I'll talk about. That a lot of the work needed actually happens before, you know, our first popular programming and concept design phase. And we need to find a way, like the human-centered design disciplines, of frankly charging for work that will make the product better and more suited to a broader human use. So here, I think the potential for our impact, and by the way, I think architects are really, I am pro-architect, and I think we're really good at human-centered design work. And I think the promise is maybe in finding structures that incorporate more of this work into our own rather than leaving it. To the right, this is a graphic that I'll refer to throughout the next few slides, which is a popular way of organizing the design phases in a product or service in a different industry, which really divides itself into these 2 diamonds. The first is a research phase, and the second is a delivery phase. And the kind of idea of this second graphic assumes at the very beginning that we don't know what we want to do, that we need to discover more about the problem before moving into schematic design. And I think it's all simple, but what's powerful to me is that we prioritize the framing of the problem as much as the delivery of the schematic product. And when you listen to Parvin talk in TED Talks, the WikiHouse TED Talk, he is the founder or the creator of that project. He makes some great points about how many times he's noticed that the building of a building is maybe not the best solution. And being able to be the one at the table that is able to help a client figure out that actually you don't want to build a building, maybe you want to design something else, is I think empowering for us to feel that we can operate a higher stream. So I think the third thing, kind of related to the first thing, that is difficult about our profession and will make human-centered design difficult is kind of related to the first, but is this idea that bold visions and suffering on the left. This is Ayn Rand's Howard Roark, is the way you get good work done and you innovate, and that being humble and asking questions and actually being okay with not knowing what you're doing is the wrong way to do things. And I would say this is something that's going to get us into trouble. And on the right is just a shot from a research phase where I was working before Waterloo, where we spend, again, that whole first diamond of time trying to understand what the problems are, where the insights lie, and really ask people to be involved in shaping the solutions. So this has been a kind of framework that I've relied on in my teaching, and has kind of been at the center of the courses and the work I've been doing in the last kind of 5 years. I'll show you some examples. I know we have some students here that were part of this course. So some attempts to teach future architects how they could incorporate these ideas into practice. The first kind of set of work being about this first phase, the discovery phase. So this was ARC 570. And here we were looking at how we could learn and deploy tools for democratizing the input of architecture. So looking at a wider swath of input data rather than sitting at the studio desk and designing hermetically. So students went out into the world and talked to people, and I hope were surprised and developed documents that outline the things they heard out in the field rather than the things they heard coming from their own assumptions, and learned a couple tools, storyboarding. And what's really exciting to me, I mean, is that we get to steal tools that work in leading to more human-centered foundations in other industries, and then adapt them to architecture. And that's what I'm excited as a design instructor in finding are the ways that these tools can be most adapted to architecture. So storyboarding and talking to people about the emotional highs and lows of their use of a space. I think Nicole might be here on the call. The charting of emotions using very typical architectural tools like the plan. So here we have the use of space, but color coding emotional highs or emotional lows on top of floor plans. Again, looking for tools of representation that let us embed human emotion and experience rather than rely purely on our focus on things like alignment or kind of graphic fetishes. And I think there's some really exciting stuff here that the students are working on. So coursework and student work looking at how do we find the right representations, and then some practical work, also like trying to deploy these things that we're learning in school out into the real world. So this was a project that my research group, Humanics, did with UHN, which is University Health Network. And we were asked to, it was a multi-year funded project, to look at this phenomena of naturally occurring retirement communities. And these are buildings that exist in Toronto that contain many and over 40% senior citizens. And these are buildings in which the seniors in those buildings have pooled their resources to to bring in services that would otherwise be delivered by an elder care facility, et cetera, et cetera. So these are kind of like DIY retirement homes. And so we did a lot of work to get a list of these buildings. I was going to zoom you guys into these because they're so teeny, but they look very, bland and familiar. And these are this is the environment that our seniors are aging in Toronto. And so the ask from UHN was, how do we understand these buildings from an architectural standpoint and human standpoint? And how do we envision solutions that might allow seniors to better self-organize, and maybe even if we can get the owners on board, make some building modifications that would fit this new clientele. So we were there to understand the human use of these buildings, but also to chart the elements and features of the buildings, and then to offer new ideas. So it was really sexy work, taking pictures of washing machines and dryers, and mostly talking to people, which I don't have pictures of for reasons you could imagine, but talking to residents of these buildings. And when I look at this stuff, I just think this is what this is what I could imagine students doing more of, and us learning from real world situations, which I think happens too little, but it's fascinating. So the things you can learn from, you know, the woman that owns this apartment and had a story that actually contributes to her feelings of why this space was good or what things about the space were bad are very, very telling. So my plan is to try to talk over this as it plays. We put together this document that you know, went to the client and outlined a whole bunch of things and came out of our human-centered design process. The inventory, the things that we thought mattered in the buildings, the data on where those traits were in the existing buildings, an audit of existing buildings and things that were good and things that were bad, discussion with the residents, an understanding of the literature that was out there. We illustrated the literature mostly in papers, graphically, so that our clients could understand it spatially, and then kind of culminated the document in a set of recommendations for how spatial edits could be made to any of these buildings in a very generic way, to any of these buildings, to socially engage seniors more actively. And the purpose of that document now is to go into a second phase of design where our clients and hopefully us sit down with seniors and talk through these ideas. And again, they're being edited and refined, but we're still in this kind of first triangle. The second triangle is also, I think, really interesting and starts to touch on these questions of non-expert design. So if the first set of work was design for people, how do we design for a broader swath of people using human-centered design tactics? The second is how might we involve people in designing themselves, which, you know, start to be, can align sometimes the motives for those. If people are allowed to design themselves, you know, they can take ownership in the product and sometimes for reasons that make sense, design things that are better for them than we might interpret. So I'm really interested in kind of like tweaking a term that's out there already, which is end user development, which Oliver probably knows very well. So end user development or end user programming refers to activities and tools that allow end users, people who are not professional software developers, to program computers. I'm interested in how we could kind of steal that concept, but hybridize it with design for assembly. So design for assembly is a process by which products are designed with ease of assembly in mind. If a product contains fewer parts, it will take less time to assemble, therefore reducing assembly costs. So I think these two ideas touch on a lot of the things we've talked about so far. My priority has been to really understand where is the human in these, and what are the things that make assembly easy and assembly hard. And I think that you know, there's probably a lot of overlap with haptics as well. As I look at the history, as we look at the history of these ideas, there's clear overlaps disciplinarily. We have, you know, what Theodora was talking about. This is the architecture machine group and the Iona interface. So this question of how can non-experts design, it's been here with us for a long time as part of our history as a discipline. We also have the hardware side of that, which is how do we self-build? And we have Walter Siegel in the 70s proposing formats and templates and protocol for how people can use standard lumber that they can find around them to assemble their own structures. But we also have I think end user design and assembly is also very familiar to us today. And I think there's industries in which, to which we can look and that are actually doing this incredibly well. And that we might not think normally as being perhaps precedents for our work. But we have obviously IKEA that has started to adopt, I'd call a platform approach to design, where they are thinking about multiple phases of a product and are offering users fairly easy to understand tools for how to assemble and customize these products. At the end of this, you obviously click buy. So this kind of has been a focus on that second triangle. So how do we design and how do we prototype physical things and put the designs in front of people? In the human-centered kind of filter on this, the question is also how do we design and get it in front of people? And so that has been what again 570 was looking at, was how do you now move from understanding inputs to actually having proposals for design and also circulate that in front of users. And so this is the work of members of this class that are here on the call, where we can see reconfigurable designs that are modular and component-based, like the early digital stuff, but that are also physical and tangible. And so trying to find a way of engaging users in design that is really intuitive is kind of the question. And that's been something I think I'm nearing the end here that I've increasingly been thinking about, this question of intuition. And I think it ties to maybe the superpowers that haptics could give non-expert users in doing things that are complex. One thing I've been looking at is scaling. So how could one-to-one scale interfaces make design easier to understand for non-experts? And so we've been building these little experiments that look at how, imagine this is a washer dryer or a kitchen sink, how you could make end user, if this is loud, how you could make end user design so simple that someone really unfamiliar with any kind of digital tools could also engage in the process. So here we've got some foam blocks and a room configuring an online tool, which also could be a building information model, et cetera, et cetera. I think there's 3 promises that I'm looking at. These are my last 3 slides. And I'm really, yeah, and I think one of them is, as we move forward, is the question of designing platforms rather than products. So using human-centered design to think through the design of a platform rather than a singular object. So something that can be flexible is the kind of object of design. But one is to ask how these platforms could make use of irregularity and not ask for consistent standardized inputs. So up in the north, the question is how could local builders and local hardware stores make use of a more open source platform that could still allow locals here to assemble things and give them aids, but also not require them to buy an expensive IKEA system from down south. This would help us with waste use and circularity of materials that are here in the north. And again, I'm thinking in a northern context, but affordability, local manufacturing and energy. But I think importantly, and this is what I come back to when I think through the design of platforms and the involvement of end users, this question of empowerment is really a really big one. And I think we'll link to the last suggestion that I'm going to show here. But one is to design platforms for local materials. Second is to address the need for hackability and interoperability. So to recognize that if we buy a kit of parts system from Iqaluit just had their first modular project, and their Chinese built modules that will now be here for a very long time but are proprietary, that when something breaks on this kit of parts system, we're able to fix it with readily available materials. So designing for hackability and designing for interoperability, I think, is a second promise. And here on the right, you see, unfortunately, low quality, but ingenious hacks. And so how could we encourage people in low SES, socioeconomic areas, or people in remote areas, how can we encourage the hacking that already happens, but kind of up the quality on it? And then finally, a kind of nod to today, I think that the third promise of this second diamond of design and the designing of platforms is a little bit represented by what we're doing today, but I think is about the transfer of information and our ability to design tools that let us share expertise. And so on the one hand, I think of the IKEA instruction booklet, and I think that's more squarely related to the stuff I've shown. And so being able to provide custom instructions for user designed goods, I think, is one great promise. But I think a second is something more like Instructables, where our own knowledge that we're generating in studio can actually be shared out into the world. And I think I'm excited by what you guys have been doing, and I think today is a great example of that attempt to share knowledge. And I think that there's a whole project there in trying to link. And when I think about the North, I actually think the promise is in not us sharing up, but maybe up sharing down, and finding a way to learn about a number of these practices that are happening now. I hope I'm okay for time. That was broad, but I want to thank you guys again for putting it together.